hosted by me, Oli Noor. This, as we know, the self-assessment is coming up very soon, and questions about finance is on everyone's minds. And we see in society that everything that we do is transactional. Whether it's buying a house, a car, clothes, we are always being pushed to borrow money. And even we see this with credit cards and saving accounts. And when it comes to all these transactions, there is the question how we as Muslims can deal with those, because they have the element of interest in it. So today we have our guest, Safdar Alam, who is experienced in the field of Islamic banking and finance, and he is also the former global head of Islamic structuring at JP Morgan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam, and hello.
Okay, welcome to the show. So I just wanted to ask you a few questions regarding the Islamic banking and finance, but before we do that, I was wondering if you could give yourself a little bit of extra introduction for our viewers, just to know that you are coming from an experienced background.
Okay, sure. So my background is in investment banking. I'm a qualified chartered accountant, and I moved into banking. And for the first few years, I specialized in non-Islamic banking. So many of the things I did were not halal, right? I was a specialist with exotic derivatives, structuring and trading. But a few years later, when Islamic banking was a possibility, I moved into Islamic banking while I was at UBS, and I helped to set up the Islamic banking team there. And then I moved to the Middle East, and I helped to set up the Islamic banking team at Crédit Agricole, a French bank, and also at JP Morgan, one of the largest investment banks in the world. So my career has been spent working at some of the foremost investment banks in the world, and I've been specializing in Islamic finance for about 2 decades now.
Okay, mashallah. Sounds like you have quite the repertoire behind you. And the biggest question for us as Muslims, and we've seen this come up time and time again, whether it's mortgage, student loan for education, the question of interest always pops up. And so I wanted to ask, what is riba, and why is Islam against riba? And really, I think with your background, maybe if you can give us examples of the effects of interest or riba.
Okay, so riba, from a religious point of view, it's one of the most fascinating aspects of our religion for me, because I have a finance background. And if you look at riba, so first of all, if you look at the punishment of riba is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Messenger declare war upon you. Right? And this is mentioned in the Quran, and it's one of the only activities in our lives where so the consequence or the punishment is a declaration of war. So it's almost unique in that sense. And then if we look at riba, again, for something that has such a incredibly strong punishment, the actual definition and clarity around riba is generally quite poor, right? And so to me, that's very fascinating. So in broad terms, we have riba as mentioned in the Quran, for example. And that's mentioned in the context of the lending of money and the repayment of money, but a higher amount. And so there's a reference in the Quran specifically about a type of transaction that was very popular at the time. And it was the lending of money with a certain amount of time to repay, maybe 1 year, and the amount that would be repaid would be double. So this was part of the economic culture. And if in 1 year's time that amount wasn't able to be repaid, the loan would be extended for 1 more year, and the amount doubled again. So the amount was, it's exponential. It'd be double 4 times and 8 times and 16 times. So you can imagine if in a number of years you're unable to repay, then that really means you're never going to be able to repay. So that meant that through many generations, many families and communities ended up in financial slavery. So they literally became slaves of the lenders. And so this is the practice in the Quran that's prohibited. And reference is made to the multiplication and doubling of capital. And this is the activity where it was mentioned to a certain tribe that if you don't, in the Quran, if you don't forego your claim on the riba, the excess, then Allah and His Messenger declare war on you. So this is the riba mentioned in the Quran. Now, riba is also mentioned quite extensively in hadith as well. And this is to do with different aspects of riba. So this talks about riba in the context of trade, in the context of buying and selling goods and exchanging goods. And it talks about how riba can occur if you have, for example, if you talk about certain items, there's a hadith about 6 ribawi commodities, which are gold and silver and wheat and dates and barley and so on.
Yes.
And it talks about how if you exchange those commodities, but you exchange a different volume for another volume, then that can lead to riba. And if you differentiate the time of exchange, so if I give you 1 bag of dates now and you give me in return 1 bag of dates but in the future, then this is classified as riba. So there's many other examples like this, and for me this is interesting because it touches upon what riba can be, and it gives it through some direct examples, but the direct examples, they don't explain that much in my view, but it opens the door for us to analyze them, to understand how riba can be applied. But one interesting thing we find amongst the scholarly work at the classical times with riba is, and this may be due to a couple of reasons, I think. One is in general, scholars, classical scholars, any scholars, will be reluctant to make ijtihad on an area where they don't have expertise. And the second thing is, I think, linked to the punishment. The punishment of riba is a declaration of war. So what we found is that the classical scholars, even in the 4 main madahib, they do not really expand very much at all from the primary textual evidence in the Quran and the Sunnah. So they don't like to almost try to extrapolate what else could be implicated as riba. So the focus is purely on exchanging of certain types of goods and when you pay for the goods. But there's not much scholarly work done on how that is applied to modern markets, for example.
So the original Quranic and Hadith principles are kept intact and not expanded upon that much. So it's the idea of the transactions happening on spot, and that it is when it comes to products or commodities, it is, if I understood correctly, a product that is like for like. And this is on top of the what was going on in the society of the Prophet ﷺ at that time, which sort of reminds me of payday loans, where they end up going down in circles with debts.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know, for example, with payday loans, we know the modern issues with them, and it is a regulated activity in the UK, but many of them have had problems with regulators. Because once you get into the field of debt, of usury, then historically this is seen as, not just in Islam, but in many cultures and communities, this is seen as a seedy activity, right? Yes. So even in Christianity, for example, usury is forbidden. In the Bible, in the literature, it's absolutely forbidden. And so if you look at the classical history in Europe, for example, where you had you had money lenders, but money lenders were always seen almost as like a very low part of society, right? They were not mentioned in polite company, and you would only go there if you had real problems. And so that impacted where money lenders could operate. So in Europe, they would tend to operate in the sleazy parts of town, because not in the more respectable parts of town. And even Christianity, so they made usury impermissible, much like Islam has. But over the centuries, they found that very difficult to legislate, because they found that trying to ban interest had too much of a commercial impact, and they just were not able to do it. So in the Middle Ages, they passed a law in Christianity to say that usury is not outlawed completely, but only high levels of interest.
Okay.
So they made that compromise many centuries ago, but it's something, luckily in Islam and Islamic banking, we haven't made that compromise. So generally you'll see one of the aspects that, I would say pretty much all the scholars agree on is that in modern finance, anything termed as interest, a loan which has interest, that this would be classified as riba. So this remains, it's a majority view. That there is a minority view that claims that maybe it's not riba, but the vast majority of scholars, and all these on the institutional side, Islamic banking, they all agreed upon the basis that interest in loans is riba.
Okay, so now that we're talking about the Islamic banking and financial institutes, how is it that they are able to offer certain products or certain financial tools without having to without having to demand riba, or how are they able to circumvent riba in their products that they offer customers?
Right, okay, so to understand this, I think we need to take a step back and look at
Okay.
banking in general. So when we look at a bank, so what most people call a bank, but technically this is it's an entity that has it is regulated and it has applied and it has been given a banking license, right? So not any institute. In the UK, for example, if you set up a company, you can't call yourself a bank. You can only call yourself a bank if you've obtained the banking license. And now this is something where I think not many people understand, but to apply for a banking license, you must do certain activities. So if you look at the FCA, which is one of the regulators in the UK,
That's the Financial Conduct Authority?
Absolutely,
Yeah,
the Financial Conduct Authority. So they give very clear advice to institutions who are considering setting up as a bank. And they say, first of all, consider whether you need to be a bank. So when you look at the technical definitions of a bank, for example, if you take deposits from customers, that's not enough to define you as a bank. You don't need to be a bank, right? And if you give loans, so if you're, for example, you mentioned a payday lending company, you don't need to be a bank, right? To lend money, you don't need to be a bank. So there's only one specific scenario where you need to be a bank, and that is when you take deposits, first of all, and then you use those deposits to support lending, right? So that means you're actually placing at risk the customer's deposits
to
support the activity of lending.
So the activity of depositing money and lending money is linked to one another, and that is what makes it a bank.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. And if you don't do these two activities with that link, the FCA is very clear that you don't need to be a bank, and they say don't apply to be a bank. So the point of me explaining this is that when an institution has gone through the process of applying to be a bank, this is because these are the two activities that they do, right? And I think it's reasonable to assume that the UK has one of the most advanced regulatory structures in the world, that in other countries where they go through the process of giving a banking license, the requirements are going to be largely the same. So when you say we have an Islamic bank, what that means is that institution has gone through the regulatory process to apply and be given the license to be a bank. So when they do that, it means, one, they're taking deposits from customers, and two, they are placing those deposits at risk by the activity of lending money and providing credit to customers. So each of those activities in a normal banking space, when you place a deposit, you're going to expect some interest back, right? That's one thing. And if you're an institution where you're going to give a loan, you expect to charge interest. So the question that you asked is it's wholly relevant, because when you ask how do Islamic banks do this without avoiding interest, my answer is that they don't. They cannot avoid interest, because that is the reason why they exist. If they wanted to, for example, if they wanted to remain wholly within Sharia perimeters and do trading of goods, for example, like buying and selling goods, then you don't need to be a bank, right? And if you want to invest in companies or invest in ventures and take real commercial risk and have an income based on your risk, whether it works or not, then you don't need to be a bank. You can invest in companies. It is a different regulated activity, but you don't need to be a bank to offer those services. So when we look at Islamic banks, we have to understand that, one, they're taking deposits from customers, and two, they are using those deposits to fund lending, right? If they don't do that, then they don't need to exist as a bank.
Okay, so it sounds quite, the very fact that they are tied down to the banking regulation itself means that they are collecting deposits that are, if I've understood correctly, that are directly linked with the act of lending out the money. And that itself is really the basis of interest.
Well, you're absolutely right. When you lend money and you charge for the act of lending money, and you're taking risk on the borrower, you're taking credit risk on the borrower, and what you're doing is you're charging interest, because that is it's like the quantification of your risk, right? So if somebody presents a higher credit risk, you're going to charge them more interest, but you're not linking your repayments to any commercial activity.
Okay, so So I've been reading up some of these products on, for example, mortgage. There's these things called murabaha, and it seems, at least on the website, how they offer it to customers, it is that it seems like they're the ones who are providing, not necessarily the capital, but they state that they are the ones that are purchasing the house as opposed to lending the money, and they are after that selling you the house or selling the customer the house at a higher rate but in installments. So I was just wondering where how that relates to the idea of a banking license, if it is instead of buying the house rather than lending the money.
Right. Okay. So if we take a step back and say, imagine that I wanted to do this for my business, me and a few friends, that we want to buy a property.
Yep.
And then we want to sell it onwards to another customer, right? If we want to do that, there's nothing along that stage of any of that process where we need to have a banking license.
Okay.
You don't need to, because it's purely investment and trading in regular assets. So now the Islamic banks do this. So they do this as part of there's 2 or 3 structures that Islamic banks use for financing home purchases, and one of them is murabaha. It was the first one that was used. There are now some products that are a bit more popular, but murabaha is the first one. So what they do is the bank purchases the property. First of all, the customer has to nominate a property.
Yes.
The bank will purchase it in alignment with the customer. So the customer effectively will place a deposit. Whether it's 10 or 20 or 30%, the bank will invest the rest of the money and buy the property. Then they will sell the property to you, but they will sell it at a much higher price. And this is a higher price that then the customer, you repay back to the bank over 20 or 25 years. So this sounds like a purchase and a resale, and this is how murabaha is presented. But when we have to remember a couple of things. So one is that this is a bank doing it, not a property trading company. So banks only lend money, otherwise they would not exist. So when you look at how banks create the lending, it's effectively from utilizing an asset, but at the end, they create a payment obligation from the customer to the bank, right? So if you look at this payment schedule, or the nature of this repayment,
within the banking industry, to have a banking license, you have to be in the business of taking deposits and linking those deposits with lending money, and how Islamic banks have these licenses. And just before the break, to continue our point, we were talking about these financing tools like musharaka and such, where they, at least on the Islamic bank's websites, they show how it is not a lending facility, but two contracts, one where the bank purchases the item to be financed and then resells to the client. And Brother Safdar, sorry to rewind back the point, if you can start with the issues that exist within these sort of contracts.
Sure. Okay. So, so the claim that Islamic banks make is that they don't do lending; they do buying and selling. So this claim is completely wrong. It's completely false. And so the evidence of that is in what I was explaining. So in a murabaha, the bank, along with you, would purchase the property and sell it to you for future repayment. Now, the answer is in this repayment. So you ask the bank, how do you calculate the repayment? And sometimes they're transparent on the websites, and sometimes they're not. But I know how they do it because this was part of my work. So they look at the capital that you have to repay. They look at your credit risk, and they look at the duration of repayment. In the UK, our mortgages are normally 25 years. And then they use the interest rate. So, and it's clear, if you ask them, they will use an estimate of the interest rate for that loan. That's why their rates are very similar to conventional mortgages. So they will take the cost price of the house. Let's say the house is worth £100,000. And they will assume you're repaying over 25 years, and they will then calculate using an interest rate, an annual interest rate, which is maybe, in the market now it's 2 to 3%, for example, and they would use that to inflate the sale price that they need. So they will calculate what your future interest rate repayments would be over 25 years. and they would simply add that cash amount to the cost price of £100,000. So if it comes to £50,000 interest, they would simply add that to the cost price of 100 and say we're selling the house to you for £150,000. So this act, and also when they use a different model called diminishing musharaka, where they lease the house to you, the price at which they lease the house is benchmarked to interest rates. And they'll be clear on that. If you ask them the question, they will be clear that they are benchmarked to interest rates. Now compare that to any regular business where you're buying and selling. So if, for example, I go to, if you go to a takeaway and you buy a chicken burger and chips, £3, say it costs £3, then there's a mechanic in there, because the shop has inbuilt their cost, fixed and variable costs. So let's say it costs them £1 to make the burger and chips, and they sell it to you for £3. That's their markup, right? And so how they work out their price is based on local market pressure. Like how many shops are doing the same thing around them, what's the local price, and can they sell it for £3 or £5 or £2? And so they work out what they can do. Now, Islamic banks, when they calculate the price that you pay as a customer for a home, it is, without exception, every single time benchmarked to interest. Okay. Right?
And
it's not benchmarked to any sale price.
And this idea of benchmarking to interest, it reminds me of a conversation I had with a friend who had a savings account with an Islamic bank. And he saw his, what they call the expected profit returns, I believe. He saw it drop dramatically, I believe, as the Bank of England interest rate dropped. So it dropped around the same time and by about the same amount. And so I was wondering if you could comment on the not just the mortgages, but also just these simple saving accounts with expected profit returns.
So with Islamic banks, when you have a savings account, you deposit money with them, they can't pay you interest, but they give you a profit rate, whether it's expected profit rate or target profit rate. And so this is classified as profit and not interest. And what your friend experienced is exactly right. So I've done some modeling on this, because what you're doing is, this is my claim, and it's like as obvious as claiming that water is wet, right? My claim is not a difficult claim. It's that when you lend money, for example, if you're a bank and you take money from a customer on a deposit or savings basis, you have to pay them interest, right? There's nothing else you can do. And if you lend money to a customer, you can only charge interest. So this is my claim. So with Islamic banks, for example, they give you a target profit rate. And I remember I did some analysis for Islamic banks in Malaysia, because they have a much deeper sector than we have in the UK. They have something like 18 to 20 Islamic banks, and they're well regulated. So I remember this claim was made. Many Muslims don't accept the criticism of interest. So they would say, well, no, we get profit and we don't get interest. So I did some analysis from public data in Malaysia, where they listed the profit rates paid by Islamic banks over a period of 10 years. And I modeled this against the interest rates paid by conventional banks in the same time. And I put the two charts over each other, and their correlation was over 99%, right? So it shows that, where the activity of taking savings and paying interest on them, the amount that's paid by Islamic banks is exactly the same. So the only conclusion to draw is that the underlying risks and the activities are exactly the same. It's a deposit, and you must pay interest on it. So regardless of whether you try to hide it and call it profit, or you use profit on a transaction or profit on investment, it's always going to come back to interest rates, as long as what you're doing is an interest-based activity. Like, you can't hide it.
And just from a sort of a layman's perspective, I just see this, and I think with any sort of investment, you can project profits and loss, but you can't have them fixed expectations. And so the question rattles around in my mind: what if the actual profit is more or less than the expected profit returns?
So this is something Islamic banks they often have to do. You cannot guarantee profits unless you have a sale transaction. But if you have an investment type transaction, you cannot guarantee profits. So this is why, when you look at savings accounts, for example, they will often say this is the target profit or projected profit, but in reality, you will always get that amount, right? Because it's an interest rate. If the target profit was 3% and the bank actually somehow managed to earn 5%, they would not give you 5% return. You would get 3%. And if the bank earned 1% on your money, they would still give you 3%. right? And this is proven in one area in Islamic finance which has public documentation, which is the area of sukuk or Islamic bonds, that often so there's reference to a target profit rate which is linked to interest, and then it's very clear in the documentation. And I gave an open lecture on this a few weeks ago, where if the profit that's earned is in excess of the interest rate, it's not given to the investor. And if the profit is earned that's less than the interest rate, then the amount is just made up so it matches the interest rate. So this is a very common practice in Islamic banking, to claim on the one hand that it's a target profit, but in reality it's interest.
Okay. So after hearing all these critiques of Islamic banking and finance, the biggest elephant in the room is that we call it Islamic. And so who here decides that these are products that are Sharia compliant, or that they are halal products to sell to customers?
Okay, so one thing I want to make clear, because at the moment I've just been critical of Islamic banking, is that I am the biggest supporter of Islamic banking that I know, right? So I made many efforts to change my career to go into Islamic banking, and I left the official Islamic banking industry a few years ago because I just could not match my view of Islam and interest with what's going on in the industry. So I'm still active in Islamic banking. I've written a series of books, and I still teach Islamic banking at university. I do workshops, and I'm doing projects to support a true implementation of Islamic economics and banking. So I'm a very big supporter of that. But my claim is Islamic banking as it exists is just not possible in an Islamic framework. And so when we look at Sharia compliance now, what you tend to have is that Islamic banks tend to have a Sharia board. So they employ, normally not as full-time employees, normally on a consultancy basis. They employ 3 or 5 or 7 Sharia scholars to advise them on all the activities. And also we have Sharia standards. So there's an association, a global standard setting institution in Bahrain called AOFI, which set globally recognized Sharia standards. And they are very involved and very detailed. But the issue we have is that we have what I would say, instead of the dog wagging the tail, we have the tail wagging the dog. So we have banks who need to do certain things, and they have ensured that all the Sharia approval that they get for their contracts is in line with their activities where they have to lend and charge interest. So we have, for example, in the AOFI Sharia standards, which are very detailed, but they're weak in my view. So they do permit and facilitate these hidden transactions that facilitate interest. And recently I had a conversation with, obviously I know people at these institutions, so I was speaking to them at a senior level, and they said to me openly, they said, we know this goes on, that Islamic banks do this, but what can we do? And I said, well, you're the regulator, you should be in control of this. So if you want to have a serious plan to deal with this, then I outlined a plan, how they can combat this and how they can effectively take control back of Islamic activity in the hands of scholars, because at the moment it's not in the hands of scholars. And I explained to them exactly how it can be done, and after some review, they said we can't do it. And the reason they can't do it is because, unfortunately, being tied into the banking system, these regulators are paid by the banks. Right? There's nobody else who pays them. They're not paid by governments. They're not paid by individuals. They are paid. They are funded by the banks. So it's then impossible to ask these institutions to take steps to prevent interest when it's in the bank's interest to execute interest.
It sounds like the scholars have the scholar consultants. They have quite a it's effectively an untamable beast, or near untamable beast, that they are trying to regulate. And so what can we as the average Joe consumers do regarding the Islamic banking or finance, in your opinion?
Right, okay. I mean, I certainly agree with what you said about scholars, that I think they're in a position where they have no control. And that's really, it's a real testament to what we're doing. We're placing them in a position where they have huge conflict of interest, and their scholars are being marginalized. We're not using scholars to move forward our economy and the state of the Ummah, where we're treating them very badly. Right? And also, if you look outside of Islamic banking, there are many educated scholars who speak out against the practice of Islamic banking. So it's not just, so for example, if you are a scholar involved specifically in Islamic banking, then you are giving approval to products that have really strong links with interest. And the situation is that if you don't give those approvals, you will not get a job in Islamic banking. You will be marginalized, you'll be removed and replaced by a scholar who would. So the scholars who have opinions, and a lot of them do, who have opinions that recognize the reality of Islamic banking, they are immediately marginalized. They're not employed in the sector. So I think one of the things we can do is try to give scholars the rightful position in making decisions on Islamic economics and Islamic banking. So this means looking at scholars who are outside the closed circle of Islamic banking and give them a platform to speak. And there are many articulate and knowledgeable scholars who do that. And in terms of Muslims ourselves, what can we do? So there's a few things, we know the hadith about there's 3 levels of iman. We react when you see something wrong. Yes. You see something oppression. So we can certainly apply that. So first of all, I would say, and this is, whatever I say, however I criticize, I place the strongest burden on myself. So first of all, you should act against it. So this is something I've tried to do. I write about it. I do many videos and educational work. And I've started a few projects where I've tried to implement, a true version of Islamic economics, but not everybody can act against it. So what we can do then is that we can speak against it. So first of all, we can educate ourselves. There are materials around that talk about the reality of this, and it's linked to the reality of the financial system and fiat money and economics. It's not just a problem for Muslims. So we can educate ourselves and educate others around us about the reality. And then if you're unable to do that, then at least feel something in your heart. And I think in the UK, I think we have a very positive situation, because many places where I've worked, I've spent my working life in the Middle East and in Southeast Asia, Malaysia and Indonesia. Islamic banking is much more part of the framework there, right? And in the UK, it's not. And I think that's a good thing, because Islamic banking in the UK is still seen as something new. So what that means is I think we have the platform in the UK young. To...
Oh, sorry. So because of the reality that the Islamic banking finance industry is young within the UK, are you saying that it has the most potential to grow into and develop into something that is closer to the Sharia in that regards?
Yeah, absolutely. That's absolutely correct. So the UK Islamic banks have been here for about 2 decades, but not in any meaningful numbers. I mean, we have a couple of Islamic banks, but they're small. And they do Islamic mortgages, but not many people take them out. I mean, most of the customers are foreign people who want to buy property in the UK. So I think it's a good thing that Islamic banking has never really taken off in the UK. Because, for example, if you try to implement change in Malaysia, it's almost impossible, because it's an industry with a monstrous size. On global terms, the Islamic banking industry is around $4 trillion. So when you have something so big built on something that's so wrong, like interest, is very difficult to change, because there's too much vested interest for it to change. So in the UK, we don't have that history. So and we have actually a lot of very intelligent Muslims in the UK. We have one of the world-leading platforms in fintech. And so what I've seen is many interesting projects in the UK taken up by young brothers who are maybe not traditionally trained in Islamic finance, but they know about the dangers of interest and debt, and then using technology to try to develop very good business models. And the frequency I see of that in the UK, even though it's such a small market globally, but it's there's much more going on, and scope for things to go on in the UK, much more so than in many of the other traditional markets in the world, the traditional Islamic markets in the world.
So we should try and encourage and support whether they're scholars or just simply the regular Muslims, in trying to not only educate, but in the various projects that they have in Islamic banking and finance, to try and support them, to try and bring some, as you said, meaningful change to this industry, especially as it is so young in the UK. So I saw this tweet online by Elon Musk. I'm not sure if you've been following, where with the thing that's going on in America about the shorting and such. But I don't want to focus on the shorting and forex and all this and that. But he mentioned something that is very Islamic in principle, that you can't buy or sell, you can't sell what you don't own. And it's not just riba that is the only haram element within Islamic finance, is it?
Yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, so in general, in Islamic finance, the principles are, they're really, really simple principles, right? So one of them is don't charge interest, and another one is don't sell what you don't own. So this is, it's not necessarily to do with riba, but it's to do with, it's an element called gharar in contracts, that
Yes.
don't enter into contracts that you might not be able to fulfill. So one of them is, and this is a principle mentioned in many hadiths, right? Don't sell anything that you don't own. If you sell something, make sure it's in your hand, right? So this was an example was given in markets, that if you are selling something and the item you're buying is across the other side of the market, the advice is to actually go there, physically have it in your hand, right? Don't buy or sell something that's not in your hand. So in modern markets, short selling is used a lot, and it's highly destructive. And so we've seen this materialized in the last week or so with some markets and some stocks. And what we've seen is effectively almost like vigilantes that individuals have taken upon themselves to act against the establishment. And they've taken some very, I'm really supportive of this. They've taken some actions to act against those who were short selling. And some hedge funds have lost billions of dollars. And so in general, the major rules we have in our economics and commercial law, they are really simple and really good rules. And one of them is to do with short selling, as you mentioned.
Okay, Jazakallah khairan. I also want to say that there's a lot of information when it comes to Islamic banking and finance, and you mentioned earlier on that you also educate, whether it's in institutes or university. Do you have any online resources or anything that, or you can point us in any direction where people can learn a bit more about Islamic banking and finance?
Okay, what I would say first of all, much of the educational material in Islamic finance and banking is created and supported by the Islamic banking industry. So much of it is very biased and it's misleading. So and so it might. So I mean, I do have a website with a blog where I've written some blog articles, and I made some video series about some modern things. So I talk about cryptocurrency and Bitcoin, and I talk about some modern Islamic banking contracts. I have a series of books which are technical books on Islamic banking. So there's a lot of educational material around, but I would say be careful, because 90% of it presents Islamic banking in the wrong way, because they try to draw Muslims in to something that really is built around riba and interest.
Okay, Jazakallah khairan. And earlier on, you mentioned that despite your criticisms or critiques of Islamic banking and finance, there is a responsibility to change things in whatever capacity, whether it is to support others. And you mentioned that you've taken a little bit of the burden yourself. And as I understand it, you're behind a project called Nia Banking. And if you can briefly, or I don't know if I got the name correct, but if you can briefly give a little background information about Nia and maybe some of the intentions behind it. Pardon the pun.
Okay, so so I'm a co-founder at Nia. So I mean, I hesitate to say Nia Banking because it's not a bank, and it's not going to operate on a banking license. But in order for people to understand what we do, often we use the word banking or banking platform or banking app, but it's not going to be a bank. So in the UK, as I mentioned, Muslims don't have very many options. And so one of the things we're trying to do is to create an institution that gives Muslim options. So we're trying to, so there'll be basic things like that we all need, like a current account and a debit card that you can use in any shops and online. And so then we want to look to produce, to deliver basic products that Muslims need, whether it's savings accounts, investments accounts, and then moving on to assets, for example, home finance. So this is one of the biggest problems Muslims have. Even the Islamic mortgages are not Islamic, and conventional mortgages have riba. And this is a real problem we face in the UK. So one of the things that I think Muslims need is a viable home purchase solution that does not involve interest. So these are things that we'll be looking to try to do to give Muslims what they need, and give Muslims a platform to actually for something that belongs to Muslims. Up to now, all we do is, if we want to open an account, we say, can we open a bank account at Lloyd's? Can we do it at NatWest? It's like we're looking around the financial landscape, and we're trying to eat the crumbs of what's around us. We're trying to pick and choose what's Islamic, what's not Islamic, and we're treated like second or third level citizens, right? So, but I think one thing we should do in the UK is stand up for ourselves and say, we are Muslims and we want things created for us. So this was the thinking behind me and the brothers who are the co-founding group at Nia. And so Nia is live. We're going through alpha testing. We are regulated. We have a platform. We have cards that we can use. They've been used abroad and online. We're in alpha testing, so we have a small group of users of that, but that's being expanded all the time. And so sometime in Q1 or Q2, we are going, inshallah, for a more significant launch to a more public round of launching our service. So inshallah, things are going well.
Okay, mashallah. It's good to hear that you're quite active in the field, not only in educating Muslims about Islamic banking and finance, but also in starting your own project. I know you have other projects enumerating behind the scenes, but this is one that is, inshallah, come to fruition. May Allah put barakah in your endeavors. And I just want to thank you before we end the program, Jazakallah khairan, Safdar Alam, for coming on the show and giving us an insight and in-depth interview about the Islamic banking and finance and some of its products and its criticisms. So please join us next week on Being Muslim, so that with our guest. Only on Ion TV, Sky Channel 782. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.